In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. Well, in addition to the coronavirus, today is also one of the least favorite days of the year for me. And I ask you to forgive this use of the word, the stupid time change. I hate it. You go to bed like normal, and in the middle of the night, in the deep, dark night, while we sleep, it comes and steals an hour. Actually, this night, as it turns out, I woke up at 1:59. And this is absolutely true. And I went off to the restroom, and when I came back, it was 3:03. That's a startling thing to find out. And I just keep thinking to myself, that is not right. What happens in the night? These sneaky things in the depths of the night. Time just magically disappears. That's pretty powerful. Magical things do happen in the middle of the night. Fortunately, not all of them are as miserable as the time change. You may remember back in 2004, I went on a sabbatical. And I used that time to study the relationship between Abraham and Isaac. And because I am no academic, I chose to put my findings into the form of a novel, which I called The Hiding of Isaac. And we did a book study about it. You may or may not remember that. But one of the things for me was that in that novel, I placed the call of Abraham, who was still called Abram at the time, I placed that call at midnight, in the depths of the night. It doesn't say that in the reading, but that's what I placed it. I'll tell you why in a minute. But before we get to that, let's jump to the gospel today. Nicodemus also comes to Jesus in the dead of the night. And I just have to imagine that it was midnight. Now, why? Let me ask if you remember a novel. Several years ago, a novel came out called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. I don't know if you remember that. It was a story of a murder trial, a guilty verdict, and then ultimate acquittal, and it all took place in Savannah, Georgia. So a lot of the novel really was about life in Savannah, Georgia, including a subculture of what you might call voodoo sort of religion that thrives there. And in that subculture, and this is where the novel gets its title, midnight is the witching hour. Midnight is the time when good and evil intermingle for just a short moment. And those who experience that time have to choose their path. Do they choose the good or the evil? I bring this up because choosing one's path is central to both of the readings that we're discussing today. Both to Abram and to Nicodemus. And it's also central to us. Because for us, Lent is that dark night. Lent is that time for us to look within and then to choose a path. Last week we talked about being in the wilderness, and we still are in the wilderness. But this week we realized that the path is dark. And yet in that darkness, God speaks. In this darkness, we sneak in to hear Christ because we are attracted to Christ, even though we're fairly certain that others will think us crazy for that attraction. In the darkness of Lent, we are given two paths to choose from: Christ or not, rebirth or old life. And we have to consider what that means for our lives. Because, like it or not, when you choose Christ, that changes your life. When you choose to follow the path that God gives you, your life will change. And for Abram, what he discovered was it's not just one change. This initial choice, when he heeds the voice of God, when God says, "Come with me," leave your family. He has to leave everything. His family, his home, the security that he had, the status that he had, and a good chunk of his wealth. He has to leave all that behind. But over the course of his journey with God, for years, he learns that the things he has to change, they just keep coming. He has to change his name. He has to undergo and convince his entire household to undergo circumcision. Now there's a conversation I would have loved to hear. He has to give up his children. He changes his home several times after leaving Haran. And although you don't think about it too much, read that section carefully, because he also changes his wife. And if you don't believe me, look up Keturah, his second wife. Lots of things change for him all the time. Now for Nicodemus, in the gospel, the considerations were somewhat different, because Nicodemus is in the ruling party. He's in control. He's in the Sanhedrin. That means the stakes are incredibly high for him. He's got an awful lot to lose without ever leaving his home. If he chooses to follow Jesus, he risks everything. Inside him, even though it doesn't look like a lot, a battle rages, a choice between that rebirth that Jesus offers and the old life. And the trick with Nicodemus is we really don't know how that story ends. With Abraham, we know. He does it and he undergoes changes over and over and over again. With Nicodemus, we don't know. The story leaves off with him just standing there in the darkness of the night. Now we should note in the Gospel of John that Nicodemus does appear twice more. Once, a few chapters later, it's clear that he still remains sympathetic toward Jesus because he urges the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin to listen to Jesus before they condemn him. But they shout him down, and he doesn't make any attempt to argue. He shuts up. And then at the end, after the crucifixion, he helps Joseph of Arimathea with the embalming process. But even then, at the end of the gospel, even though he seems to still live in the place of choosing, his life seems to still be at that midnight hour. And he can't decide how he's going to live. Do I stay in the seat of power, or do I move over to Jesus? We still don't know. But then again, maybe that's just as well. Because that's Nicodemus' life. That's not our life. And we have our own lives to deal with. We have our own gardens to stand in. We have our own midnights where we stand in the darkness and see two worlds laid before us, and we must choose. In the early church, baptism used to be at midnight. It used to be at midnight because that's the time of choosing good or evil. That's the time of death and rebirth. But it doesn't really have to be literally at midnight, does it? The time for choosing is always in front of us. In fact, it can be any Sunday morning. Next week, Bishop Dietschy will be here to baptize, confirm, and receive. Not at midnight, but at 10 a.m. Nevertheless, it is a time for publicly stating a choice. For those young people to stand up in front of the church and say, I choose Jesus. The thing I try to impress upon them is they're a lot like Abraham. Because choosing the path that God lays simply means that they are going to have to choose tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after for the rest of their lives. Like Abraham, the choices never stop. For all of us, the choice to follow never stops. We're confronted with it anew every single day. And that's one of the reasons I love Lent so much. It reminds us that it's still midnight. It reminds us that we have choices to make. Now, for some people, choosing the path of God, it may be the first time for them. They've never thought about it before. This is all new. And for others, they are a lot like Abraham, where it's just one more path that God puts in front of us. And we have to choose again. And for others, still, it might be a little bit like Nicodemus, where we've been standing there wondering, do I choose God or do I choose my old life? Because that can go on endlessly, can't it? You can be standing on the razor's edge for all your life, undecided whom to choose. But that's not really living, is it? So I invite you to use this midnight of your life, this Lenten season, to choose. Choose your path, whether for the first time or yet again. Choose. Because as we all know, like it or not, time moves forward. Sometimes stealing an hour. Sometimes it feels like years. But one thing we know, night will end and day will come. And then, no matter what we've chosen, we will have to live it. Amen.